And at a certain point, I felt it wasn't right for me to be writing this fiction. I'm not Toni Morrison, who's a genius and does it very well. What actually happened is something that no fiction can actually encompass. Two, I was looking at Andrew Jackson, and I realized when he had hollowed out all the Indian territory, that this was the center of what became the Cotton Kingdom, which became the center of the Confederate States of America, and that unless he had gotten rid of the Indians, it wouldn't have been open for it being populated by plantation owners and dug out by their enslaved labor. And number three, there was a young man who looked at one of my stories, which was set during the Civil War on a plantation, and the experience of the African Americans during the Civil War on that plantation. And he said, "My dear, that was all very nice, but you know the Civil War wasn't fought about slavery." So there we go.
So what we're going to do now, this isn't exact, we're going to do a little reading, party out. This wasn't exactly the text of the book. This is the text of the first chapter of the book, part of it, rewritten lightly to be a little more oral. We're preparing right now, I'm very excited to announce this, on October 28th at Symphony Space in New York, we're going to have a musicalized version of this, which is going to be spoken voices. 7 spoken voices so far, maybe go more. Nona Hendricks has just joined the cast, and with live music, a score by Donald Harrison, Big Chief Donald Harrison, with musicians. And we have no idea what's going to happen. And we won't know until the day before the show, really. But it's very exciting. So I've been working on a script, which is excerpts from this rewritten lightly, and we're going to read a little 2-voice version of a part of that right now. We alternate voices, and like I say, we'll try to make sure y'all can hear us in the back row. Should we stand? No. Okay. First of all, I know y'all can handle it, but trigger warning. This is hurtful material. This is sensitive material. The N-word which you will hear is the least of it.
We're going to be describing the workings of an economy in which people were capital, children were interest, and women were routinely violated.
Virginia was the mother of slavery, wrote Lewis Hughes.
It wasn't just a figure of speech. During the 53 years from the prohibition of the African slave trade by federal law to the debacle of the Confederate States of America, the Southern economy depended on the functioning of a slave breeding industry, of which the state of Virginia was the #1 supplier. When Lewis Hughes was born in 1832, the market for slaves was expanding sharply.
My father was a white man and my mother a negress, Hughes wrote.
That meant he was classified as merchandise at birth because children inherited the free or enslaved status of the mother, not the father. It had been that way in Virginia for 170 years already when Hughes was born.
Partus sequitur ventrum was the legal term. The status of the newborn follows the status of the womb. Fathers passed inheritances down, mothers passed slavery down. It ensured a steady flow of salable human product from the wombs of women who had no right to say no.
Most enslaved African Americans lived and died without writing so much as their names. The Virginia Legal Code of 1849 provided for stripes or flogging for those who tried to acquire literacy skills. A free person who dared assemble with Negroes for the purpose of instructing them to read or write could receive a jail sentence of up to 6 months and a fine of up to $100 plus costs.
An enslaved person who tried to teach others to read might have part of a finger chopped off by the slave owner with the full blessing of law. so it was an especially distinguished achievement when in 1897 the 64-year-old Lewis Hughes published his memoir. Like the other volumes collectively referred to as slave narratives, it bears witness to a history slave owners did not want to exist, the first-hand testimony of the enslaved.
By the time Lewis Hughes was 12, he had been sold 5 times. The 3rd time he was sold away from his mother to a trader. As he described it,
"It was sad to her to part with me, though she did not know that she was never to see me again. For my master had said nothing to her regarding his purpose, and she only thought, as I did, that I was hired to work on the canal boat, and that she should see me occasionally. But alas, we never met again."
the trader carried the boy away from the Charlottesville area that had been his home, down the James River to Richmond, where he was sold a 4th time to a local man. But he suffered from chills and fever, so the dissatisfied purchaser had him resold.
This time he went on the auction block, where he was bought by an aspiring cotton planter who was setting up in Pontotoc, Mississippi, a booming region that had recently become available for plantations in the wake of the delivery of large areas of expropriated Chickasaw land into the hands of speculators.
Slaves were designated by geographical origin in the market, with Virginia and Maryland-born people commanding a premium.
It was held by many that Virginia had the best slaves, Hughes wrote. So when Mr. McGee found I was born and bred in that state, he seemed satisfied. The bidding commenced, and I remember well when the auctioneer said, $380, once, twice, and sold to Mr. Edward McGee.
McGee had plenty of financing, and he was in a hurry. He bought 60 other people that day. A quote, prime field hand would have commanded double or more. But even so, the $380 that bought the sickly 12-year-old would be more than $10,000 today. Like the largest number of those forcibly immigrated to the Deep South, McGee's captives were all made to walk from Virginia to Mississippi in a coffle.
Walk from Virginia to Mississippi in a coffle. Southern children grew up seeing coffles approach in a cloud of dust. A coffle is a train of men or beasts fastened together, says the Oxford English Dictionary. And indeed, Lewis Hughes referred to the coffle he marched in as, quote, a herd. The word coffle comes from the Arabic kafila, meaning caravan, recalling the overland slave trade that existed across the desert from sub-Saharan Africa to the greater Islamic world centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. With the development in the late 15th century of the maritime trade that shifted the commercial gravity of Africa southward from the desert to the Atlantic coast, coffles were used to traffic Africans from point of capture in their homeland to point of sale in one of Africa's many slave ports.
But the people trudging to Mississippi along with Lewis Hughes were not Africans. They were African Americans, born into slavery and raised with their eventual sale in mind.
Force marched through wilderness at a pace of 20 or 25 miles a day for 5 weeks or more, from Cancy to Cancy, in blazing sun or cold rain, crossing unbridged rivers, occasionally dropping dead in their tracks. Hundreds of thousands of laborers transported themselves down south at gunpoint, where they and all their descendants could expect to be prisoners for life. Perhaps 80% of enslaved children were born to two-parent families, though the mother and father might live on different plantations. But in extant slave traders' records of those sold, according to Michael Tadman's analysis, complete nuclear families were almost totally absent.
About a quarter of those trafficked southward were children between 8 and 15, purchased away from their families. The majority of the coffle prisoners were male, boys who would never again see their mothers, men who would never again see wives and children. But there were women and girls in the coffles too, exposed as were enslaved women everywhere to the possibility of sexual violation from their captors. The only age bracket in which females outnumbered males in the trade was 12 to 15, when they were as able as the boys to do field labor and could also bear children. Charles Ball, forcibly taken from Maryland to South Carolina in 1805, recalled that, quote,
"The women were merely tied together with a rope, about the size of a bedcord, which was tied like a halter around the neck of each. But the men were very differently caparisoned. A strong iron collar was closely fitted by means of a padlock round each of our necks. A chain of iron about 100 feet in length was passed through the hasp of each padlock, except at the two ends where the hasps of the padlocks passed through a link of the chain. In addition to this, we were handcuffed in pairs with iron staples and bolts, with a short chain about a foot long, uniting the handcuffs and their wearers in pairs."
As they tramped along, coffles were typically watched over by whip and gun-wielding men on horseback and a few dogs, with supply wagons bringing up the rear. In the country, coffles slept outdoors on the ground, perhaps in tents. In towns, they slept in the local jail or in a slave trader's private jail. Farmers along the route did business with the drivers, selling them quantities of the undernourishing, monotonous fare that enslaved people ate day in and day out.
Sometimes the manacles were taken off as the coffle penetrated farther south, where escape was nearly impossible. But since the customary way of disposing of a troublesome slave, whether criminally insane, indomitably rebellious, or merely a repeated runaway, was to sell him or her down south, drivers assumed that the captives could be dangerous. Coffles were doubly vulnerable for robbery and for revolt, so security was high.
Sometimes, coffles marched with fiddlers at the head. The captives were not generally allowed to talk among themselves as they tramped along, but sometimes in the midst of their suffering, they were made to sing. The English geologist G.W. Fanshawe, who in 1834 happened upon the huge annual Natchez-bound chain gang led by the trader John Armfield, noted that
"The slave drivers endeavor to mitigate their discontent by feeding them well on the march, and by encouraging them to sing Old Virginia Never Tire on the banjo."
Thomas William Humes, who saw couples of Virginia-born people passing through Tennessee in shackles on the way to market, wrote,
"It was pathetic to see them march thus bound through the towns, and to hear their melodious voices in plaintive singing as they went."
North Carolina clergyman Jethro Rumpel recalled that, quote,
"On the day of departure for the West, the trader would have a grand jollification. A band, or at least a drum and fife, would be called into requisition, and perhaps a little rum be judiciously distributed to heighten the spirits of his sable property, and the neighbors would gather in to see the departure."
Rumpel was speaking of heightening the spirits of young people who had just been ripped away from their parents and were being taken to a fate many equated, not incorrectly, with death. A coffle might leave a slave jail with more people than it had arrived with. The formerly enslaved Sis Shackelford described the process at Virginia's Five Forks Depot
As transcribed by the interviewer. "Had a slave jail built at the crossroads with iron bars across the windows. As soon as the coffle get there, they bring all the slaves from the jail, 2 at a time, and string them along the chain back of the other poor slaves. Everybody in the village come out, especially the wives and sweethearts and mothers, to see their sold-off children for the last time. And when they start the chain a-clanking and step off down the line, they all just sing and shout and make all the noise they can, trying to hide the sorrow in their hearts and cover up the cries and moaning of them they's leaving behind."
An enslaved person could always be sold to another owner at any time. When Lewis Hughes' coffle reached Edenton, Georgia, McGee sold 21 of his newly purchased captives, taking advantage of the price differential in the lower South to post an immediate profit on a third of his Virginia transaction and thereby hedge his debt to his financier. Charles Ball described a deal that took place on the road in South Carolina.
The stranger, who was a thin, weather-beaten, sunburned figure, then said he wanted a couple of breeding winches and would give as much for them as they would bring in Georgia. He then walked along our line as we stood chained together and looked at the whole of us. Then, turning to the women, asked the prices of the two pregnant ones. Our master replied that these were two of the best breeding winches in all Maryland, that one was 22 and the other only 19, that the first was already the mother of 7 children and the other of 4, that he had himself seen the children at the time he bought their mothers, and that such winches would be cheap at $1,000 each. But as they were not able to keep up with the gang, he would take $1,200 for the 2. The purchaser said this was too much, but that he would give $900 for the pair. This price was promptly refused, but our master, after some consideration, said he was willing to sell a bargain in these winches and would take $1,100 for them, which was objected to on the other side, and many faults and failings were pointed out in the merchandise. After much bargaining and many gross jests on the part of the stranger, he offered $1,000 for the 2 and said he would give no more. He then mounted his horse and moved off. But after he had gone about 100 yards, he was called back, and our master said if he would go with him to the next blacksmith's shop on the road to Columbia and pay for taking the irons off the rest of us, he might have the 2 women.
Women with babies in hand were in a particularly cruel situation. Babies weren't worth much money, and they slowed down coffles. William Wells Brown, hired out to a slave trader named Walker, recalled seeing a baby given away on the road.
Soon after we left St. Charles, the young child grew very cross and kept up a noise during the greater part of the day. Mr. Walker complained of its crying several times and told the mother to stop the child's damn noise or he would. The woman tried to keep the child from crying, but could not. We put up at night with an acquaintance of Mr. Walker, and in the morning, just as we were about to start, the child again commenced crying. Walker stepped up to her and told her to give the child to him. The mother tremblingly obeyed. He took the child by one arm as you would a cat by the leg, walked into the house, and said to the lady, "Madam, I will make you a present of this little nigger. It keeps such a noise that I can't bear it."
"Thank you, sir,"
said the lady. From the first American coffles on rough wilderness treks along trails established by the indigenous people, they were the cheapest and most common way to transport captives from one region to another. The federally built National or Cumberland Road, which by 1818 reached the Ohio River port of Wheeling, Virginia, was ideal for coffles. It was the nation's first paved highway, with bridges across every creek. Laying out approximately the route of the future US 40, its broken stone surface provided a westward overland transportation link that began at the Potomac River port of Cumberland, Maryland. From Wheeling, the captives could be shipped by riverboat down to the Mississippi River and on to the Deep South's second largest slave market at Natchez, Mississippi, or further on to the nation's largest slave market, New Orleans.
A domestic slave trade had been in existence since early colonial times, but beginning after the War of 1812 and continuing up through secession, massive numbers of captive African Americans were trafficked south and west by every possible method in an enormous forced migration. William Wells Brown wrote that
a drove of slaves on a southern steamboat bound for the cotton or sugar regions is an occurrence so common that no one, not even the passengers, appear to notice it, though they clank their chains at every step.
As railroads extended their reach, captives were packed like cattle into freight cars, shortening the time and expense to market considerably. Some passenger trains had servant cars, though a cruder term was more commonly used. On his first trip to the South in January 1859, the 21-year-old New Englander J. Pierpont Morgan noted, quote, 1,000 slaves on train. They were trafficked by sea in ocean-going vessels that sailed the hard passage from the Chesapeake around the Florida Peninsula to New Orleans, as well as in shorter voyages within that route. Ocean shipment was more expensive than a coffle, but it was quicker, so it turned the capital-intensive human cargo over more efficiently.
Though, of course, exact figures don't exist, it's safe to say that tens of thousands of African Americans made the coastwise voyage from the Chesapeake and from Charleston to New Orleans and up the Mississippi to Natchez, as well as to Pensacola, Mobile, Galveston, and other ports. More
Slave ships came to New Orleans from the east coast of the United States than from Africa. In a shorter recapitulation of the Middle Passage of a century before, the captives were packed into the hold with ventilation slats along the side to keep them from suffocating. Upon arrival, they were discharged into one or another of New Orleans' many slave pens, where they were washed, groomed, and fed. Their skin was oiled, their gray hairs, if they had any, were dyed or plucked out. On sale day, they were put into suits of the finest clothes many of them would probably ever wear, with perhaps even top hats for the men. Most would be sent to the cotton fields, where inhuman levels of work would be extracted from them through torture, or to Louisiana's death camps of sugar.
A few more days and the trouble all will end, in the field where the sugar canes grow. A few more days for to tote the weary load, no matter, 'twill never be light. A few more days for to totter off the road, then my old Kentucky home, good night.
That's a song about a man being worked to death in a prison camp in Louisiana after being sold down south. It is the third verse of the Kentucky State Song.
Following the precedents set by the Europeans who referred to the coastal regions of Africa by their exports, the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast. Some writers have referred to the Chesapeake region as the Tobacco Coast.
But it would also be appropriate to call it the American Slave Coast.
By hemispheric standards, the African slave trade to English-speaking North America was petty. Elders and Richardson estimate that only about 389,000 kidnapped Africans were disembarked in the ports of the present-day United States, the majority of them before independence.
Only 389,000? That's an enormous number of captives to be dragged across the ocean.
But the estimated total for the hemisphere is 10.7 million Africans who arrived, out of an estimated 12.5 million embarked, leaving 1.8 million dead at sea.
There's no way to figure the collateral damage to African populations with even a rough level of accuracy. Slave raiding, which was typically conducted by Africans, was notoriously wasteful of life. Since only the young were taken and often the rest were killed, if one died for everyone taken captive in slave raids, that would mean the transatlantic slave trade killed or enslaved some 25 million Africans. It could have been double of that. There's no way to know for certain.
Those estimated 389,000 Africans trafficked to the territories of the present-day United States account for fewer than 4% of the hemispheric total of Africans who came to the Americas. Barbados, an island about the size of Queens, New York, appears to have taken in more Africans than the entire territory of the present-day United States.
Africans were only the seed. By 1860, those few 100,000 Africans had given away to 4 million African Americans.
Each birth was, as Thomas Jefferson described it, quote, an addition to the capital. This was in a letter that he wrote that said, I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital.
The South did not only produce tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton as commodities for sale, it produced people.
Virginia had been slave breeding since the 17th century. It had the oldest, most deeply rooted African American population and the largest, with far more slaves than any other state, and with much of its land already burned out for tobacco farming by the time of the Declaration of Independence. The agricultural productivity per laborer in Virginia was low. The most profitable thing for Virginia planters to do with their growing slave population was to sell young people to traders for shipment down south.
The existence of slavery in the United States was taken for granted by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. There was little or no discussion about abolishing it. The African slave trade, however, was very much in contention. None of the delegates assembled at the Constitutional Convention could know that there would soon be a revolution in Saint-Domingue, the future Haiti, much less that as a consequence, Napoleon Bonaparte would make a snap decision to sign his claim to Louisiana over to the United States in 1803. But it was commonly understood that territorial expansion was coming.
Everybody knew that the upriver hinterlands of New Orleans were being invaded by Anglo-American settlers who would eventually take the territory over through force of numbers. Charleston merchants had a long-established web of overland trade that spread 1,000 miles across Georgia and across what we now call Alabama and Mississippi into Louisiana.
The frontiersmen of Kentucky and Tennessee were itching to drive the Native Americans out of Alabama and take their rich black land. Spanish Florida had from the beginning been a security threat to South Carolina and Georgia. It too would come under U.S. control.
The market for slaves was about to explode in volume, and everybody at the Constitutional Convention knew it. The question of who would have the concession to supply slave labor to this plantation empire to come was an obstacle to unity at the Constitutional Convention, occasioning a power struggle between slave-breeding Virginia and slave-importing South Carolina.
The Virginian and Maryland slave breeding industry was a unique creation of Anglo-American entrepreneurship. Slave owners in Virginia, and in smaller numbers Maryland, were uniquely positioned to sell slaves into the emerging markets. It could not have happened anywhere else in the hemisphere. Unlike the sugar slaves in the rest of the Americas, who frequently died after 8 or 10 years of hard labor, or the rice slaves of South Carolina, who worked standing in water all day under miserably unhealthy conditions, the tobacco slaves of the Chesapeake didn't die off. It was unprecedented. Their numbers increased every year.
Prohibiting the African slave trade to the new United States would create a grand bonanza for Virginia slaveholders at the expense of South Carolina. Charleston was the major receiving port in North America for kidnapped Africans, and South Carolina's delegates to the Constitutional Convention wanted no federal interference in their market-driven opening and closing of the trade. Chesapeake slave owners, who were the only ones with sufficient surplus labor to sell off, wanted the African trade permanently closed.
But the delegates from Virginia had to compromise if they wanted South Carolina and Georgia to be part of the new nation instead of an independent, belligerent, slave-importing competitor for power next door. One, moreover, whose territory was the overland gateway for expansion into the Deep South. They compromised on a 20-year guarantee that the foreign slave trade could exist on a state-by-state basis. Accordingly, Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution reads,
"The migration or importation of such persons